morning, everybody, and welcome here at the webinar on biodiversity footprinting for companies and financial institutions. Very happy to have you here today. We'll be discussing a lot on the basics of biodiversity footprinting and the whole agenda, the context, which is quite heavy at the moment. So I'm very happy to present to you everything that you may wish to hear. Going to the agenda. We will basically divide our session into 4 parts. So I will be presenting the biodiversity reporting landscape with a few of my colleagues, with the context on biodiversity footprinting, the regulatory international context, but also the news around. So you have a perfect picture of what basically it involves. Then we'll be going a bit diver into the TNFD and some proposal for financial institutions, then the SBTN. And then we'll be jumping to a more fundamental part on how our methodology, so the GBS, the Global Biodiversity Score, works and how it's linked to the whole context of biodiversity footprinting. Then we'll be showing to you our basically the landscape around and the ecosystem we are creating around biodiversity footprinting and the GBS with the B4B Plus Club, sorry. And then a case study, and I thank a lot Jacques and Kaiwei from L'Oréal will be showing their case study. So let's jump to the first session, but perhaps I can slowly also introduce myself because I haven't done it yet. So I'm Campredon. I'm quite new at CDC Biodiversity. I'm the new deputy director, so in charge of the GBS. I just left the French Treasury, where I was in charge of sustainable finance, so negotiating the whole framework agenda, meaning the taxonomy, CSRD, etc., with a specific focus on biodiversity, because I was seconded to TNFD, so 1 day a week, and I was also part of the negotiation on COP15. I was the European negotiator for Target 15, especially. So very happy to talk about this and how we can at CDC explain how our tool and how biodiversity footprinting is very useful to answering this target. But first, about CDC Biodiversité. So I hope everyone knows a bit about it, but to make some reminder for everybody, we are part of the group Caisse des dépôts et des consignatures, which is a public institution in France. So we are a subsidiary. We have developed from now a few years this methodology on biodiversity footprinting, and that we launched in 2020. And from then, we have been basically developing our tool and developing the whole ecosystem around it, and we'll be pushing for more more integration of biodiversity footprinting in the whole framework, international, regulatory, with the French, EU, and international level. But we also have other activities, which is basically also providing some inputs to us on how basically on the field, on the ground, how it works. So with long-term restoration and ecological management, and a lot of activities linked to biodiversity. Before also diving into the topic, perhaps a short introduction of the team, because we have a lot of incredible people on the team. So we basically divided into 5 main parts. The part of the BFA, so it's biodiversity footprint assessments, which is basically assessing biodiversity footprint of companies. We also have a finance part with Violette, who is in charge, who basically is dedicated to financial institutions and providing dedicated solutions for them because they have a different profile. Also a part which is quite important with Patricia, who is with me now, who is basically dedicated to development and to the whole methodology part, to everything that is very useful. And also the whole ecosystem around with the club, with Elisa from the club B4B+, and Emily from the trainings. And also Joao, which is developing a solution for local authorities. Also, before diving into topics, on Menti, we ask you questions on a few questions to get to know you a bit more. So perhaps we can show the first results if you had some time to answer the questions. If I haven't, we can come back to that later on. It depends. Oh, okay, here we are. A few results. So it's very important for us that we have a whole panel of participants, meaning the people that are already quite involved into the work on biodiversity and biodiversity footprinting more specifically, but also people that are just curious about biodiversity studies and biodiversity scores. So please welcome here. I think you are in the same in the right place, because we'll start from the beginning, and then in the end of the webinar, I hope so, you will have like a whole picture of how this whole ecosystem works and how it's basically linked to the international and regulatory framework. So please welcome. And this is very, very key for us that we have also all this information, so we can basically like provide the good level of granularity when we organize these webinars. Okay, so without waiting, perhaps we can dive into the first part of the webinar, which is basically the whole context and the whole landscape on biodiversity reporting. In this part, we'll basically start from the beginning. So what is the context of the loss of biodiversity, why it's important, and why do we have to act right now? So the international answers then, so how does the international community is organizing with COP15, etc., etc. And then what do we provide here at CDC Biodiversité? So biodiversity footprinting. So not only our methodology, but the whole ecosystem of biodiversity footprinting. And then, well, how it's basically developed and how it's linked to the regulatory framework. So it's quite heavy now with CSRD, with a lot of initiative at the French and EU level. So hope we can provide an explanation of that. And then the final part with the GBS. So first, the loss of biodiversity. Well, I think you're all aware of that, but a few reminders are quite key for us. So for quite some time, the academic world has showed that we are facing a biodiversity crisis, like a huge one. For some time, until very recently, it was quite reserved to a kind of academic community that was basically talking to each other. But now, for a few years, and we're very, very happy for that, like the whole thing gets very public, and the whole thing gets from politics, from the media, from everyone, that everyone was showing actually like what the researcher, the academics have shown for a few years. And we are facing a huge crisis, which is called, for example, the 6th mass extinction, the first caused by man, etc., etc. So we are trying and we are starting to provide answers, but we have to hurry. So in this graph, you can basically show, see that our current level of biodiversity, which is basically representing MSA, which is the metric we use, the mean species abundance, and which will be described a bit later in the presentation. It's basically describing the whole integrity of ecosystems. So basically you have a full picture and a global picture of biodiversity. And on the second graph, you can see that if we don't act, if we don't do anything, we'll also lose another 10% of biodiversity. That's why we have to make this whole exercise of basically make a diagnosis. So where we are right now, what are our impact, our dependencies, our risk to the biodiversity, and then draw some trajectories and some lines towards our objective in 2030 and in 2050. On the next slide, basically beyond the academic world that has been showing this crisis, a lot of institutions also described how to act and how to translate this crisis into actions. And the first one is to identify the main pressure on biodiversity. And here we have a description of the pressure that have been shown by the IPBES report in 2019, quite important report. It's a bit like the GIEC. The GIEC is the French word, sorry. Whatever. So you have 5 main pressure on biodiversity. So it's the land, water, sea use change, the resource exploitation, or overexploitation, the climate change, all the pollutions, and the invasive species. And these all pressures are described, and a lot of drivers of this pressure are caused by man, and that's why we have to identify and work on that, and it's the basis of our tool and the basis of our work at CDC Biodiversité. Then the international framework. So as I was explaining, you have the academic world showing the crisis, then you have the financial international institution showing that how are the main pressures? And then we have the global answer from members of the COP, so basically the Conference of Parties, which is basically gathering every 2 years to try to deal with biodiversity. And we had this huge deal in December. I guess you have heard of it, which is basically the design and agreed on the Global Biodiversity Framework, so the GBF, which is quite important for us because it's drawing a trajectory in 2030 and in 2050 to show where we are now and where do we have to go if we want to respect our planetary boundaries, if we want to respect all our engagement, etc., etc. It's quite simple. It's divided into 4 main goals to reach in 2050. The main goal is the goal A, which is dealing with ecosystems, and it's basically translated into 8 targets, which are translating goal A into concrete action in 2030. And basically you have every target which is showing a main pressure. For example, you have target 7 on pollution or target 8 on climate change. We also have like an important one is target 15, which is part of goal D, meaning the means of implementations. Means of implementation are quite important because perhaps a few of you remember, but we had the Aichi targets, which is basically the international agenda from 2010 to 2020, which was quite a failure. And one of the reasons for that is that we didn't have the monitoring tool and the means of implementation to actually reach the targets that we set up. So now we are talking about like concrete stuff like money, how to use it, how much, and how to involve more private actors that are quite important in our market-driven economy. And I will be describing this a bit later on. I wanted to make a short focus on target 15 because it's quite important for me, but also it's quite important for you and for the whole ecosystem and for the whole ecosystem private actors. It's basically quite innovative in the sense that it's the first time in the international world that we create this obligation for every party, so every party of the COP, everyone that has signed the agreement, meaning 196 countries, so quite everybody except the US, to basically set up a reporting and disclosure framework for companies and financial institutions so they can disclose their risk, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity along all the value chain, which is quite important because we at CDC Biodiversité, we develop a tool that is designed for the whole value chain. And this is quite important because we have, like, for example, a lot of examples on the main impact in the value chain on biodiversity. So then going into like more description of the link which was made from the diagnosis of the biodiversity crisis and how do we act. It's basically, so the figures that I was showing to you, is 68% of remaining biodiversity. So that's where we are quite now. And then with this trend, if we don't do anything, then we'll be losing this 9.5% of biodiversity. This translates this global agreement, especially goal A, which basically say no net loss until 2030. And as of 2030, then biodiversity gains. And you can show the curve and the line, which is basically going up, which is even more ambitious than on the climate side. Because on the climate side, we just want to reduce impact. Then we have to, on biodiversity, make some gains. And this is an international agreement. I have to hurry up a bit. Sorry, I'm taking some time. Then on the next slide, it's basically now making the link of this whole ecosystem, this whole agenda that I was showing to you, meaning international framework and how do we answer that, the crisis, etc. And what do we believe very much is that in this world where you are a private actor, you have to act. Engaging into like a biodiversity footprinting is something that is very, very key for you and for the whole society actually. And it has a lot of advantage. First, it's this kind of diagnosis or evaluation part. Using a biodiversity footprinting allow you to have like a huge map of where are your impacts, what is material to you, and identify your priority actions. That allow you then to act on that, on the main pressures, so you have to have identified, and to set quantitative and global targets. So you can draw a line then to reach them on this kind of agenda you can set up. And then you can monitor because it's quantitative and it's easy to monitor and it's continuous improvement. So then on the next slide, it's also some advantage of biodiversity footprinting. I mean, already described a few of them, but we set up like this graph for you, so you can identify that it's important for the risk management of your company, because it's allow you to identify your dependencies on ecosystem services. You can also adapt then your operation and supply chain, extra. Then it's also very much is very key on the transparency part and on the compliance. It's basically a bit linked. But when you will be, you know, for example, if you are under CSRD, you will have to publish your impact and imbalances, and a lot of investors, everyone will be basically looking at you. If you assess your footprint, you could have like quantitative and very scientifically based quantitative figures that you can show, and you can say, okay, where we are now, and you can allow your community to follow your progress, and to feed your requirements in a very ambitious way. So now we also have this regulatory framework that's been designed for a few years, and which is also helping to get to this ambitious goal that we set up at the international level. I mean, at the EU level, we are quite a pioneer in this, because we set up like for 2018 a few regulation and a few directives that are basically slowly entering into application. You have the European taxonomy, which will be key, for example, for biodiversity. You have some news from yesterday, actually, on the Commission publishing this new delegated act, saying that if you want to be considered, your activity to be considered as substantially contribute to biodiversity objective, you can, if you respect the threshold that have been set up in the taxonomy, consider yourself and consider your activity as sustainable in the sense of the taxonomy and with regard to the biodiversity objectives. It's very key for us, because it's the whole debate on what is nature positive. And here we welcome very much this whole exercise of trying to decide quantitative thresholds in the taxonomy, so you can evaluate whether your activity at the activity level is sustainable. Then, and it's a huge part for every private actors, is the CSRD. The CSRD is also quite some news last week, because like it's developing this ecosystem of data. It's basically the main goal. So every company at the EU level, if you respect some threshold, of course, will have to be publishing a lot of information on environmental objectives, social objectives, and among them, biodiversity play a key part. You have a specific standard, which is called ESRS E4, sorry for that, but it's dedicated for biodiversity and ecosystems. And it's like quite some pages of indicators that companies will have to be publishing quite rapidly, actually, from 2025 for some of you. And it's basically saying, okay, what is your situation right now? So your main impacts, your main dependencies, your main risks, and how you draw this trajectory plan to respect this all ambitious and this all no net loss and then biodiversity gains that we all agreed on in Montreal. There is some news around, because the Commission has published its new draft. It's under consultation and will be basically launched somewhere in quite some weeks. But we are quite happy with that, because with the tool that we are developing, and in general with biodiversity footprinting, it helps you a lot, and it helps all the actors to feed your requirements with quite some ambitious and some very material stuff. And that's why we try to work with the EFRAG, which is developing the standards, and with the Commission to basically make sure that all these indicators are ambitious but practical also for companies, and that are respecting what we have been discovering over the last years when we assess biodiversity footprint of companies and financial institutions. And then you have some part for financial institutions, which is a specific focus of the regulatory framework, because you know, financial institutions have a huge role to play in the alignment of financial flows. And it's basically the framework at FDR, which is asking information and reporting at the product, but also at the entity level. So it's a lot of information feeding the market, and you have some specific information about biodiversity. But more specifically at the French level, and I was in charge of that in my previous job, we set up this biodiversity specific and dedicated reporting framework for financial institutions in 2021, entered into application in 2022, where you all the financial institutions, all of them, basically insurers and asset managers and a few banks, will have to and already have to publish a lot of information on biodiversity on the risk part, but also on the impact part. So it's like a double materiality assessment. But also one of the requirements is to draw this trajectory of respecting this agreement on biodiversity and the agreement of the COP15, more specifically. So then we'll get back to Menti a bit. I hope you had some time to answer other questions that we ask you. Otherwise, we'll be basically discovering it at the very moment. If you didn't have time, if you don't have time, we'll get back to that a bit later on. But it's very important for us that we know to what economic sector you belong, because biodiversity footprinting and biodiversity impacts are across all sectors. I mean, all sectors have to consider biodiversity. I mean, this is the assessment that we draw over the last years. And so no one is exempted, basically, and everyone has to basically try to assess this whole impact, dependencies, risk on this sector level. So I'm happy that I see like a lot of different sectors. That's quite good, because this webinar is basically dedicated to all across the sectors. We also have other events that we organize, also webinar, other stuff that are more specific to some sectors, because of course we assess also at the sector level with some examples, some benchmark that we draw from sectors, etc. So thank you for answering this question. That's very helpful for us. And we've also asked a question for the company, on which company do you belong? It's also quite important for it, because we know what company is interested, etc. We won't reveal it right now because of confidentiality, but basically some information that will be important for us. So now we can dive a bit more on biodiversity footprinting, and that I've presented to you this whole international and regulatory framework. Diving a bit into biodiversity measurement tools. So we have at CDC Biodiversité developed for a few years now the GBS, so the Global Biodiversity Score. It's right there. But you also have to know that other actors, other stakeholders have also developed quite some different or quite similar other tool. It's basically you have tools that are developed and that represent into like a ecosystem integrity, and it's the case for the GBS, but also for other indicators. But you also have other indicators that are more specific to different metric, more on species or more on some very specific impact on biodiversity. And this whole ecosystem is basically a bit like the carbon footprint in the years 20 and then 2010, evolving quite fast and going to this standardization phase that we are in. But I also know that a lot of you don't know any metrics or any indicators, and it's quite important for us, because this whole session is basically dedicated for you to understand this whole framework. So thank you for answering these questions. So yeah, here you have a kind of a map of the whole, it's basically the same as the question I asked you. All these indicators that are being developed or already developed at the EU and international level represented in different metrics. So you can see like down it with the MSA, the mean species abundance that we are using here, and also other metrics that are described here. Basically, the GBS, because we'll be focusing a bit on it because it's the tool that we develop, can assess and rate the third parties, so the basically institutions, financial institutions and companies, but also can provide some biodiversity accounting for external audited disclosure. This is why you have to understand also it's at the corporate and portfolio level. It's basically, but you will have, we reach the slide and we'll have some time to get a bit diver into this graph. So now that I presented a bit like this whole ecosystem on biodiversity footprinting, we will dive a bit more into what the tool that we develop at CDC Biodiversité, so the GBS. So GBS is basically using all the data that a company or financial institution can provide and involving and assessing all the impact dependencies and risks. And basically, and it's something that I wanted also to present. So a part of the international framework, so the COP15, also the regulatory framework, so with the CSRD that is described, we also try to develop a tool that is basically linked and feed very well into the international initiative on biodiversity. And here you have the TNFD, which is quite important, and that Vincent will be describing a bit later in the webinar, but also the Science-Based Target Network, so the SBTN. This whole ecosystem that is basically also evolving at the same time as biodiversity footprinting will also help us to standardize all the information that you will provide to the market. So we have this whole ecosystem of data at the international level. So investors, stakeholders, NGOs, governments can have a view on where we are now and where do we have to go. And this whole ecosystem is quite important. And the GBS feeds very well the TNFD and the SBTN framework. Also the GRI, but it's something else, it's another reporting framework that is developed at the international level. But it's for you to understand that this GBS is basically linked to this whole international ecosystem. So then, diving a bit more into what do we develop at CDC. So as I was explaining to you, we developed the GBS. So that's the first part. So we developed it from 2016 to 2020, and we are continuously developing the tool because with assessing new sectors and new companies, we also develop new impact factors, extra. So it's a continuous development. And that's something I want to also quickly to talk about. We are developing for now more than a year a solution for local authorities, because as you know, in France and in many developed countries and also in many countries in the world, governments and local authorities also have impact on biodiversity. So it's important that we can provide a solution adapted to them. So as I was explaining, so we sell what we call BFA to companies, and we sell ratings. So we sell another solution for financial institutions. And Vincent will be describing this to you later on. I wanted also to talk about the whole ecosystem that we are trying to gather around us. So we have also assessors and consultants that are trained to use the GBS and that also providing biodiversity footprint assessments. And we also work with data providers and rating agencies on the financial institution part, for example, Carbon for Finance and other institutions. And we also have a huge link with academic world, because what I was explaining at the beginning, that the academic world was showing a lot of information on the biodiversity crisis, it's actually continuously. So a lot of academics are working on identifying the main pressure, the main tools, the main impact. So we have a perfect picture of the whole academic world that is basically developing new solutions to have a concrete view on what the biodiversity crisis consists in exactly. For example, we already only know 2 million species on the 10 million species that exist in the world. And we also have, we also train academic at CDC Biodiversité. And something also that we develop in this mainstreaming and biodiversity footprinting is that we are developing this GBS verified. It's a kind of auditing process that will allow companies and assessors to basically assess the level of biodiversity footprinting. Because what is very key for CDC is that we are not developing a tool that will be basically not be used very well by a lot of actors that will not provide the information to the market that are not exactly the one that we wish for. So we developed this auditing tool that is very key in the future. We have received a few more information later in this year. And so it's a kind of a recap of what we do. So you have financial institutions with 2 different solutions that Vincent will be describing, companies and local authorities. And we provide this common language for everybody. So coming back to the Menti, do we have other surveys that we can show, or we can?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Arthur, for this introduction. So I'm Patricia, the head of the development of the tool. And so we have Q&A time. So do not hesitate to connect to Menti. So Elisa sent you the link in the chat, and we can come back to the questions later if you have some. And now I will let the floor to Vincent, who will present you our solution for financial institutions and the link of the GBS with the TNFD framework.
Thank you, Patricia. Hi, everyone. So my name is Vincent Guénon. I work at CDC Biodiversité in the finance team, which is responsible for developing methodologies, adapting the Global Biodiversity Score to the specificities and constraints of financial institutions. So I'm going to present you these methodologies and how they fit into the TNFD frameworks. So first, it's important to note that the Global Biodiversity Score follows the double materiality approach. So we are in line with the recommendations of the TNFD. This principle of double materiality is studying the physical and transition risks, which are approached by the impacts on biodiversity and dependencies on biodiversity. So for the transition risk, more specifically, it comes from a misalignment between the company's activity or the portfolio's activity and the transition of the whole economy to an economy that respects biodiversity. So for example, you have the reputational risk, the regulation risk, market and technological risk that all compose the transition risk. So to approach this transition risk, we can use the impacts on biodiversity, which is already being measured by the Global Biodiversity Score. So for listed assets, it uses the database GBS, which I will present into a bit more detail later. And for unlisted assets, it uses specific methodologies, which are called GBS for financial institution. Then for the physical risk, it's a risk that comes from the dependencies of the activities on biodiversity. So the dependencies on ecosystem services, which means that when there's biodiversity loss and ecosystem services are not provided as well as before, the activities and the portfolio which comprises these activities is at risk of losing value. So we measure this risk with the dependency score expressed in percentage. So it's a score of dependency to all of the ecosystem services. So it's also measured for listed assets by the database GBS, and for unlisted assets, depending on the asset, by the GBS for financial institution. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about this, we have worked with the French Biodiversity Office and the French Development Agency and the French Central Bank on this double materiality for the French financial system using the database GBS, and it has been published in a paper called Silent Spring. So you have the link on the slide. To get into a bit more detail on this topic of the TNFD that recommends impacts and dependencies, the TNFD recommends to use a framework which is called LEAP. So it's a framework that is being developed as we speak, and the first version of this framework will be released in September. But we have already been consulted, and we participate also in the definition of this framework. So it's composed of 4 steps, which are called locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And these 4 steps are allowed to disclose all of the dependencies, impacts, and risk and opportunities of an activity or a portfolio. So it allows to manage all of the links of a portfolio to biodiversity. And the methodologies of the Global Biodiversity Score through the database GBS allow to answer to this framework partly. So it allows entirely to answer to the evaluate part, which requires to calculate, to compute the dependencies and impacts of the portfolio. So it's entirely feasible with GBS. And for the part of material risks and opportunities in the assess phase, it's also partially feasible with the BIGBS database. And then this information allowed to work on the prepare phase, which is about reporting and elaborating biodiversity strategies and action plans. So these the methodologies that we propose and allow to answer to this these requirements and recommendations by the TNFD. Then I will go into a bit more detail about the methodologies and for the different types of assets that we cover. So it's the methodology that we will use with the Global Biodiversity Score really differ between the assets that are studied. So for the listed shares and bonds, it's entirely covered by the BIGBS database that I've talked a bit about before, and that I will go into more details in the next slide. For unlisted assets, it will really depend on the asset because we are developing methodologies that are tailor-made for the assets. For example, for infrastructure and real estate assets, we have methodologies that have been developed especially for these assets. For private equity sector, we have launched pilots in the beginning of 2023 on private equity finance companies. So there's a methodology that has been developed and that is now mature to be shared and to be deployed on the market. And for other assets, for other unlisted assets, we have not worked on them yet, if they are not mentioned here, but we are always willing to develop our methodologies. So if you have a case study that you would like to share with us to work together on how to cover these assets, we will be very happy to work on it with you. So please do not hesitate to contact us for this. And then a last piece of information to give you a bit more detail about the BIGBS database. So it's a database that was created in a partnership between CDC Biodiversité and Carbon for Finance, which is a data provider specialized in environmental data. So this database combines the methodology of the Global Biodiversity Score, and then we fit it with the data provided by Carbon for Finance, which is data that covers all of the listed assets that you would like to evaluate. So this database is really useful if you'd like to measure and to manage your impacts on biodiversity. And also it can be used to report if you have disclosure requirements. So you can use these impacts and dependencies that you will find on the database to feed your reportings. It covers all the listed shares and bonds and sovereign bonds, and we have many first users that have used already this database to manage their biodiversity impacts in their portfolios, also to feed their reporting requirements. In France, we have the Article 29 of the Climate and Energy Law, which has very thorough disclosure requirements for financial institutions. So the BIGBS database allows to answer to these requirements. So it has been used a lot for these specific reportings. So I hope it was interesting to you what we propose for financial institutions. So I suggest that if you're interested in these different proposals, if you'd like to answer it on the Menti, so we can know your interest and maybe get in touch later. Now we get to the question. Oh, no. Maybe we'll wait a few seconds for you to answer. But then again, if you're interested and you wish to contact us later, you will find the contacts in the slides that you will receive if you are subscribed to the Eventbrite event. So you have all of our contact information, so do not hesitate to send us an email to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for this presentation. Meanwhile, you're answering to this question, we can take some questions you asked on Mentimeter. So is GBS a global approach? It sounds very French driven. So our first customers, first companies who worked with us are French CAC 40 companies, listed companies, but now we are expanding to the international companies and financial institutions. And we are launching actually also working groups within our club that Elisa will present to you later. So we are going more and more internationalized now. On the next question, so yes, we are recording this session, and we will communicate you the link on the next upcoming weeks. So are you able to evaluate the biodiversity impact of a portfolio made of debt securities? Maybe I will let Vincent answer to this question.
Thank you, Patricia. So this is not right now a methodology that has been developed by CDC Biodiversité, but if you'd like to work on it, as I said, please contact us and we'll try to see with your case study what we can do.
So another question on the portfolios, on positive and negative impacts. Maybe Vincent also, I will let you continue on this question.
Thank you. So the methodology of the Global Biodiversity Score allows to measure the impacts of a portfolio on biodiversity. With the GBS database, it will cover the negative impacts of the activities on biodiversity. It will depend if you it's possible to measure the positive impacts on biodiversity, but if it would need a more detailed level of data available. So for the GBS database, it does not cover positive impacts.
And there were first question also on the value unique selling unique proposition values for the GBS compared to other tools. So with the GBS, so we will explain you later in the different parties, in the different sections of the presentation, but we are covering the whole value chain on biodiversity. We use a metric that is recognized in the international frameworks. And also our tool connects well with the different existing approaches on biodiversity. So the TNFD, as Vincent presented to you. And yeah, I will let the floor to Manon on the link with the SBTN framework, Science-Based Target Network.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. Hello, everyone. So I'm Manon Bézard. I'm in charge of the biodiversity footprint assessments for corporates at CDC Biodiversité. And I'm going to explain to you how we assess biodiversity footprint with the GBS and how it relates to the SBTN framework. So if you go on the next slide, please. Yes, thanks. So just as a quick introduction, when we conduct a GBS-based biodiversity footprint assessment, we follow 4 steps. Step 1 is about framing. So we need to frame the perimeters and identify what we're going to assess. We also use this step to screen biodiversity issues and challenges for the company and its sector. Step 2 is the key step. It's about data collection. It's the longest one, and it's, I'm going to come back into more details about the data we collect, but it's very important because we use this data for the 3rd step, that is computation in the GBS. And then there is a 4th step, which is analyzing the results. So we give you some quantitative analysis, but also qualitative information. And we also use this step to discuss and work about targets on biodiversity and help you define some objectives for your biodiversity journey. After this biodiversity footprint assessment, your company can start to act. So it's important to avoid your impact, reduce your impact, and then try to regenerate and restore ecosystems. And then you can also implement monitoring of your actions and monitoring of your impacts. So just a quick focus on the data we use in the GBS. So we use a very wide range of data inputs. It goes from generic data to more qualitative data for the GBS. Generic data is financial information. So we collect your turnover and your purchases data. This is what we use as default information to run the GBS. But to refine the impacts, we need more precise information on your activity. So we will need to collect, for example, raw materials information. So tons of metals, tons of woods, tons of oil or gas, for example. And better data would be to collect physical flows and pressures information. So, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, water consumptions, and of course, land use information. So we collect your surfaces, and we need also to understand the intensity of management of these surfaces. As you can see on these slides, there are some minimum information that we need to run the GBS and conduct the assessment. And as you can see also, with this little cloud, the majority of the data is also collected for your carbon footprint. And we use also the outputs of the carbon footprint, of course. So as we wanted to, you can go on to the next slide. Thanks. So as we wanted to explain you in this section, the GBS also relates to the SBTN framework. So as CDC Biodiversité, we are a partner of the corporate engagement program of the SBTN. And the SBTN, the Science-Based Target Network, has developed a 5-step framework for companies to help them in their biodiversity journey. So you have step 1 about assessing, step 2 for interpreting and prioritizing, step 3, the important step for measuring and setting targets, step 4 for acting, and 5 is about tracking. And recently in May, the SBTN has released some official guidance for steps 1 and 2, and also for step 3, but only on freshwater and land. So here at CDC Biodiversité with the GBS, we try to stay aligned with those SBTN guidance on the on the ecological integrity part. So as you can see here, we can help you answer to step 1 and 2, and we can give you some elements for step 3 and step 5, but we're waiting for official guidance on these steps. If we go to the next page, so it's just a quick zoom on the first 3 steps. Step 1, assessing. The SBTN is requiring a sector-level materiality assessment that we can perform using the SBTN tool that they are providing to corporate engagement members. And they are asking for a value chain hotspot assessment. So it's a value chain map to identify where are your impacts in your value chain and identify hotspots of impacts. And if we have some information, we can also link that to your strategic suppliers. It depends on the data we collect. Step 2 is about interpreting and prioritizing. So in the guidance, they were asking companies to determine target boundaries. So we can work on that and help you define those boundaries. It's also about interpreting the results of the step 1 and ranking your actions. So understanding where you can act first and prioritizing your actions on biodiversity. And we can also provide information on feasibility or biodiversity strategy to complete these steps. And then step 3, as I said, is about measuring and setting targets and disclosing this information. For now, the guidance that have been released in May is only on freshwater and land ecosystems, and we're waiting for official guidance on biodiversity and oceans, but we're working with those new guidance to try to provide some elements for freshwater and land. So when we conduct a GBS-based assessment, you get results, impacts, dependencies, and information about remaining biodiversity also. And those results can be put into perspective and compared to area equivalents, for example, to help you understand what it can represent. So here you have some example of global orders of magnitudes. So if we take, for example, the global terrestrial static impact, it's 40 million MSA square kilometer. You can see it's equivalent to the loss of Europe, North America, and Oceania combined. So it's quite huge. So for example, in an assessment, we can let you know what your impact represent in terms of surface loss, for example. We also have some benchmark information to compare your results and help you understand how you perform in your sector. So we work on benchmark sheets for different industries. As you can see, we have prioritized the sectors, and we are conducting approximately 2 benchmark fact sheets per year. So you can already find the agriculture and agri-food fact sheets on our website, and also the chemicals benchmark that we've published in 2021. We are finalizing the construction, energy, and raw material extraction fact sheets that you will find also on our website soon. You have all the links on the slides, and they will be sent to you in the next weeks. And we are currently working on the manufacturing industries fact sheets. So this one is coming soon. Then if we go to the next slide, thank you. So as you can see, we have prioritize some sectors to work on with the GBS, and we're addressing all the sectors gradually. So here it's how we, just to let you know how we address them in the GBS. So we have identified some more mature sectors in terms of biodiversity issues and with estimated high impacts, and those sectors or the first one we worked on with the GBS, and so they are quite well addressed in the tool with some specific impact factors that have been developed for them. So it's raw material extractions, for example, agriculture, energy, and electrical and electronic equipment. Then we have intermediate sectors that are sectors we are starting to work on through assessments, and that we have already some specific impact factors developed in the tool. So chemicals, for example, textile industry or manufacturing industry. And then we have the last ones, more complex sectors with estimated lower impacts that we want to address in the tool, but it's taking some more time. So we have, for example, distribution, building sector, other services, industries, etc. According also to this, in terms of budget for a biodiversity footprint assessment, we have different options. Just first, for your information, an assessment with the GBS can last between 3 to 6 months, generally closer to 6 months. And it's quite long because the data collection phase is quite long. And then the budget varies according to different criteria. So it depends on the type of assessment we conduct. If it's only a screening of your impacts using only financial information to give you some default impact results, or if we perform a biodiversity footprint assessment using a complete range of data and building some robust assumptions, it will also vary depending on the parameter we choose to evaluate, on the sector of your industry, of course, if it's well addressed in the GBS, or if it's a complex sector. The quality of the data is a key criteria. It depends if you have a lot of available data or if a lot of data is missing, and also the format and the quality of your data, if it's matching or not the GBS nomenclature. Then we also can propose different options, like elements that we include in the report to answer to SBTN recommendations, or specific developments for your assessment and your activity. So then it leads to different options in terms of budget, screening, varying between 28 to 56, relatively simple cases that are 37 to 68K euros, intermediate cases 53 to 105, and then complex cases that are ranging from 84 to 158. Yet we are inviting you to contact us if you would like to perform a biodiversity footprint assessment, and we'll see with you what you'd like to have in your assessment and your specificities to try to find the best budget. Finally, we have listed here some examples of BFAs that we have conducted. Just for your information, there are more than 40 assessments that have been realized and or undergoing by now. So you have some examples, and the complete list can be sent to you in this presentation after the webinar. And for example, in 2023 on CDC Biodiversité, we are working with already 3 companies. You can see it's from companies from different sectors, and assessments conducting by CDC Biodiversité or also by external consultants. And we have both biodiversity footprint assessment and screenings, sectoral level materiality assessment. And then lastly, as I was saying, biodiversity footprint assessment can be conducted by CDC Biodiversité or by GBS trained assessors. So you'll have some information about that later, but you can find here the list of external consultants that have been trained with the GBS and can perform also assessments with the GBS, and you can contact us, of course. So if we go maybe back to the Menti, we would be very interested in knowing if your company would like to perform a biodiversity footprint assessment, and would be happy to send you some information and have a discussion with you on this topic. So you can answer, the results are hidden, so feel free to answer the question.
Thank you very much, Manon. And so meanwhile, you're answering to our questions. We have some questions from the participants on a biodiversity footprint assessment. So is it possible to estimate a footprint based on revenue, location, and the sector alone? Do we think the result is too approximate? So yes, it's possible. So as Manon explained to you, it's possible to make sector materiality screening, but it will be more approximate as it's based on average model sector data. So it's best if you can collect data directly at the pressure level or at the inventory level, as we showed you on the last slide. And another question on data. So do you directly collect data on land use, or do you sometimes model it from database? So we can do both. Yeah, it's best if you can directly provide land use data, so with the correct land use classification, also the area, and if possible, between 2 years of assessments to see whether there was land conversion. But if this data is not available, so we have model data or average national data, so from sources like FAO or life cycle inventory databases. So yes, we will So we will show you the slides after the session. And so I propose that we go on the next session. So I will let you answer these questions on Mentimeter. Meanwhile, I will let the floor to Vincent, who will explain to us how does the Global Biodiversity Score work.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the offers that we have for the Global Biodiversity Score, but let's deep dive a bit into the methodology that the Global Biodiversity Score relies on. So there are a few key concepts that we will see together on which the GBS is built. The key concepts are the metric, which is the MSA square kilometers, which I will explain a bit to you, and the pressure and model impacts, the scope approach, and the differentiation between static and dynamic impact. So we'll go into some details about all of these key concepts, which will help you understand exactly how we compute the biodiversity impacts and dependencies of activities. So first, let's go into the metric, which is the MSA square kilometers. So the MSA square kilometers is composed of two parts, the MSA and the square kilometers. So what is the MSA? It's the mean species abundance, and it will measure the integrity of an ecosystem. It ranges from 100% to 0%. 100% being a totally pristine ecosystem, absolutely undisturbed by human activities. So here we have two examples of ecosystem with a forest and a pasture ecosystem. But of course, this metric will cover all types of ecosystem. So let's take the example of a forest. We have a pristine forest, no human activities on this forest. So it has an MSA of 100%. And then with more and more human activities, such as the exploitation of the forest, the MSA will decrease, coming from 100 to 80%, 50, 30%. And then eventually, if it's transformed into an entirely urban area, absolutely artificialized, so for example, a parking lot, it would reach a 0% MSA. So what exactly how is it computed, the mean species abundance? So it will take the initial state of the ecosystem, and then it will measure the disturbances by measuring the disappearances of the species on the ecosystem from the undisturbed state. So for example, let's take these little boxes which represent an ecosystem with 2 deer, 2 frogs, and 3 trees. It has an MSA of 100% because the ecosystem is undisturbed. So if the ecosystem goes from this undisturbed state to the disturbed one state, we see that we have a new frog that has appeared, but then it disappeared. So the state of the frog is still 2 frogs. 1 deer has disappeared. 2 trees have disappeared, and then we have some rats that have appeared on this ecosystem, but then they disappeared also. But given that the rats were not present in the undisturbed ecosystem, they are not computed into the computation of the mean species abundance, right? Because they were not present at they do not count into the original state of the ecosystem. So the disturbed 2 ecosystem would have more remaining biodiversity, because even though there are less rats that have disappeared, the rats were not present at the beginning. So as we said, we did not count them, but there is 1 tree more than the disturbed 1 state. So the remaining biodiversity would be a bit higher than in the disturbed 1 state. So now that we know how the MSA is computed, we will see how it's transformed into the MSA square kilometers to have the final metric in which the impacts will be expressed. So on the next slide, we'll see exactly how it happens. So we take the measure of the ecosystem in MSA expressed in percentage, and we integrate it on the surface on which it is exerted. So let's take the example on the right, which is a pristine forest with an MSA of 100% on a surface of 100 square kilometers. So this forest is transformed into a plantation, which has an MSA of 30%. There's a huge biodiversity loss on this forest on a surface of 100 square kilometers. So we lost 70% MSA on 100 square kilometers, which means that we had an impact of 70 MSA square kilometers. And this can be understood as the equivalent of absolutely destroying biodiversity on a surface of 70 square kilometers, right? So why do we use this metric, the MSA square kilometers? It's really an interesting metric, and it's really shared by a lot of actors for these reasons. So first of all, it's a global metric, so it covers all of the operations of a company in all countries possible. So it's really it's a question of scope of use of the MSA. So it can be used as a unique metric. Also, it's a metric that has a transparent methodology. It was developed by the Dutch Environmental Agency, PBL. It's used in the CBD evaluations of the Global Biodiversity Framework and complementary, sorry, it's a complementary indicator of the monitoring framework of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So a lot of international frameworks and actors already use this metric, so there is quite a consensus on it. And also it's quite an understandable metric, as I mentioned to you, an impact of 1 MSA square kilometers can be understood as destroying biodiversity on 1 square kilometer. So it's really understandable by the general public. So you can share it internally with your within your company, or you can share it with your stakeholders, and they will all understand very precisely what you mean with your biodiversity impact. Then maybe to see if you followed and understood correctly, just a little quiz according to which aspects of biodiversity are measured by the MSA, the mean species abundance. So there are a few proposed answers. Does the MSA measure the risk of extinction of species, the species richness of a given ecosystem, the species abundance of a given ecosystem, or the ecosystem services provided by a given ecosystem? I will give you a few seconds to answer, and then we'll go to the correction. Do not hesitate to answer. It's absolutely anonymous. It's okay if you make a mistake. Okay. Then we'll see the answers a bit later. Let's go back to the second key concept of the GBS. It uses a pressure model called GloBio, which will transform the pressures into impacts on biodiversity. So the pressures on biodiversity are the ways on which the economic activities will impact biodiversity. So the pressures that the GBS covers are the pressures identified as the main pressures on biodiversity by the IPBES. So these 5 pressures are land and sea use change, direct exploitation of resources, climate change, and pollution. The 5th pressure identified by the IPBES is invasive alien species, and it's not covered yet by the GBS, mainly for lack of relevant and sound scientific literature and data on this pressure. The pressures then are divided into sub-pressures that we see in the white boxes, and they are divided into the ecosystem on which this pressure is applied. So there are 3 main ecosystems: terrestrial ecosystems, freshwater, which are aquatic ecosystem of freshwater, and then the marine ecosystem is not covered yet by the GBS, also for lack of scientific data and literature on this ecosystem for the moment, but we have started to work on it. We had, for example, TNFD pilot on overfishing, which would fit into the direct exploitation of resources of the marine ecosystem. So we cover all of these pressures, and then we translate it into impacts on biodiversity. So this little graph shows you exactly how we can we can use all of the data of a company or of a financial institution to measure the impacts on biodiversity. So let's work from right to left to understand it. So from right, on the right of the graph, we have the direct impacts on biodiversity. So these would be measured by ecological inventories directly on site, but it's not really feasible, of course, to do it at scale. So that's why we're going to use all sorts of data and all sorts of tools to come back to this box of direct impacts. So the pressure impact model that I mentioned is GloBio. So if we enter into the GBS data on pressures, so for example, if we enter data on the land use changes, so on the surface occupied by an economic activity, for example, the GloBio model, which will translate this pressure into impacts. We can also use inventory data. So for example, tons of commodities purchased, or also GHG emissions of an activity. And then with in-house tools, the GBS will convert this inventory data into pressure data, and then with GloBio into impact. And of course, we can always use, as mentioned previously, the financial information such as turnover or purchases in value. Let's take a quick example very quickly to make sure it's really well understood. So let's say we have a poultry meat business and we want to measure very precisely one impact, which is the poultry feed production. So to measure directly the impact of the feed production for the chicken, we could, for example, carry out an ecological survey on the fields that are used to produce the feed. But it's really difficult to do it extensively. So we could use all sorts of data. So for example, the surface of the cornfield used by the supplier of the company to produce the feed. So it's a pressure data expressed in square kilometers of crop field. We could also use the inventory data. So here it would be the tons of commodity purchased by the company. So tons of corns. And also we could use the financial data of the company. So if we enter the turnover of the company with the location of the activity and the sector of activity of the company, it will tell us, so for an activity in this country, this type of activity, on average, it will have these impacts related to the poultry feed production. So all of these data, of course, can be combined together. It's not just one specific data that has to be entered. We can combine all these data in order to have the most accurate computation of impacts possible. All right, let's move on to the next key concept of the GBS that I mentioned previously, which is the differentiation between static and dynamic impact. It's a very important differentiation. It's a very important characteristic of the GBS. So it's really important to understand it well. What exactly are static and dynamic impacts? Static impacts are the stock, the accumulated negative impact of the activity, and dynamic impacts are the variation of stock. I say variation of stock instead of flows because it's impact that will be consolidated into the accumulated negative impact in the next year. So it's really the stock that is accumulated throughout the years. It's really important to differentiate between these two impacts because as we saw at the beginning of the webinar, we have already reached the threshold of the planetary boundary on biodiversity loss. So in order to come back up to the safe space for human activities, we not only have to reduce all of our new impacts on biodiversity, but we also have to reduce the past impact on biodiversity that we had. All right, so it's important to measure precisely the difference between the past impact and the new impact. That's why we do this differentiation. Just a quick example here with a plant that is that is installed on land next to a river. So the static impact would be the impact that were present at the beginning of the assessment in the year N. So it would be the land surface of the company. It's a static impact because the company is already present. Also, the company consumes water from the river and releases pollution from the river at a constant rate. So it's a static impact. It's always the same impact. But then the company, let's say that it builds a new building next to the plant, which we see on the right. This would be a dynamic impact because it was not present at the beginning of the year. It was added during the year. And then if we move on to the next slide to see the next year, the building that I mentioned is finished. So now it's present at the beginning of the year. So it's a static impact now. It's a static impact on the surface of land use. All right. Quite quickly on the next key concept, it's a concept of scopes. I will go very quickly because I'm sure you're all very familiar with this concept. Just say that the GBS followed the scope approach, which is absolutely compatible with the GHG protocol and the natural protocol. So we differentiate impacts between the scope 1, the direct activities of the company, scope 2, which are impact due to energy purchases, and then the scope 3 is divided into the upstream impacts in the value chain of the company. So for the suppliers, for example, of the company. And the downstream impacts are linked to the use and the end of life of the products and or services provided by the company. Quick note on the dependencies, because we've talked a lot about the impact, and now we know very well how the impact are computed by the GBS, but the GBS also assesses dependencies on biodiversity of the economic activity using the Anchor database. So the GBS will use all of the data, the financial data entered to know if the activity has a dependency on the 21 ecosystem services classified by Anchor, and it will calculate dependency score, which ranges from 0% to 100%. 100% represents a very high dependency on biodiversity. Just a quick technical difference between average dependency score. So the average dependency score is the average of dependency on the 21 ecosystem services, and the critical dependency score is a methodology that we developed to represent more accurately the dependency of an activity. It means that if an activity is dependent at a very high or very high level on at least one ecosystem service, it means that if this ecosystem service is not provided by nature anymore, even if the 20 other ecosystem services are provided, the activity is at risk. So it's a more accurate representation of the dependency of the activity. And the dependencies, then on the next slide, we'll see how it is represented. We have a hotspot of dependencies by sector, by type of activity, by ecosystem services. So it has been used as I mentioned on a few paper. I mentioned earlier the Silent Spring from the financial system paper conducted with the AFD, the OFB, and the French Central Bank with the CDC Biodiversité, which explored the dependencies on the biodiversity of the French financial system. A few points on the methodological convergence, which is interesting to note that there are many initiatives to try to standardize, to harmonize the reporting and the measurement initiatives. So I will only talk about two right now, but the first one is really interesting. It's the Align project, which was launched by Business and Biodiversity, supported by the European Commission in 2021, and it should publish a measurement standard in 2023 on the measurement of impacts and dependencies of biodiversity. So we have been consulted on this topic, and it should be published quite soon. And then the second initiative is the Biological Diversity Protocol. It's for the moment the only protocol published on the biodiversity accounting, and it's really promising. We have already published, which you will see on the slide, an application of this accounting measurement standard of the BD protocol to biodiversity footprint measurement. What's interesting is that this protocol differentiates, as the GBS does, between static and dynamic impact. So it's a really promising and interesting protocol, and we think it could be applied to many tools, including the GBS. And of course, as you can see on the slide, the outputs of the GBS in terms of impacts and dependencies can feed the BD protocol. Do you have any questions? Oh, yeah, we had the question asked earlier. So most of you answered that the MSA measures the species abundance of a given ecosystem. Let's see if you were right.
Thank you very much, Vincent. So actually, we will continue to answer to the different questions directly in the chat. Just a few words on next webinar we are organizing next week, actually, on the current benchmark fact sheet we are working on the manufacturing of metal. So Elisa sent you the link in the chat. Do not hesitate to register to also receive the slides after the webinar. So I will let the floor to Elisa on the club B4B+ and the trainings we propose at CDC Biodiversité.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Elisa Magueur. I'm working as a project officer for the B4B+ Club, which is a business for a positive biodiversity club, which I'm going to introduce into further detail. So very first overview of the B4B+ Club. So it was launched in 2016. It is now composed of more than 50 companies, financial institutions, consultancies, many members that are working around biodiversity footprinting. So basically, it's a stakeholders ecosystem, which is composed of various working groups, which are detailed on the slide. So we are working on a finance topic with the finance members, on value chain, and on consultants. But we are also launching new working groups this year on biodiversity credits and on energy utilities. I will come back on the biodiversity credits working group just after. And well, on the content, I will also give you further detail just after, but we also provide some literature review around biodiversity footprinting and the specific topic we are working on. And we also provide the possibility to conduct some case studies to our members, which can be on a restricted perimeter of your activities and on innovative topics. Actually, it's really important for us to be a kind of innovative hub, to test some methodologies, to develop some methodologies on specific challenges with the members. And it also gives you a priority access to the training that I'm going to introduce just after. And you also have a GBS license and technical support on the use of the GBS through both webinars and individual technical support. So in terms of the concrete objectives and goals of the B4B+ Club, so first, the idea is really to help the members understand how biodiversity footprint assessment tools can really serve corporate decisions, investment decision, and external reporting. It's also a way to anticipate financial, regulatory, and market developments in terms of biodiversity footprinting reduction. And the idea, well, historically, is also to ensure the adaptation of the Global Biodiversity Score, so our biodiversity footprinting tool, to the constraints and needs of the companies and financial institutions, and also through the case study that we are implementing. And the idea is really to keep all the companies and members informed about what's going on in terms of regulation, in terms of technical issues, methodologies. So we have regular intervention from external experts. We have some regular bibliographic monitoring and so on. And as I was saying, the idea is also to assist our members in carrying out biodiversity footprint assessment via technical support on the GBS. So here you have the detailed content of the B4B+ Club. So as I was saying, you have a stakeholders ecosystem, which has regular meetings. So we have annual meeting with the members on the distinct working group, as just mentioned. So on financial topics, value chain, consultants, but also annually on biodiversity credits and energy utilities. So it's a real network of businesses and experts, and the idea is that it's a good place to share best practices, feedback, and lessons learned. You also have this literature review on the topics of interest, and it's really a way to build capacity and to access the trainings, technical support, and conducting technical case studies. And we will also come back later on the license, which is included in the club. So just a quick word on the very new working group we are launching on biodiversity credits. So actually the first session of this working group was held last week on June 6th, and it will be composed of various meetings all around the year. So we will have some 1-hour webinars to have some tools and methodology developers coming to present their work, and we will have a second session of the biodiversity credits working group in December. So as for the other working groups, it's 2 main meetings in the year, but this one will have more shorter webinars to have more external speakers coming to present. And part of the objectives and reflection that we are carrying out in the context of this working group is first to conduct a mapping and literature review on what's going on. And well, basically map the very quickly evolving ecosystem around biodiversity credits. So who are the main stakeholders, who are standard setters, who are the methodological developers, who are credit sellers, and so on. Also to follow the evolution of key initiatives and methodological developments and see what reports just went out and so on. We are also working on assessing the different methodologies by developing an evaluation grid to assess, compare, and position these methodologies on an analysis grid. And the idea is also to conduct some pilots to evaluate and test these methodologies concretely on the field with our members. And this is also a way to share best practices and present the results during a working group. And this is the fee schedule for the B4B+ Club. So you have a basic membership, which includes access to 1 working group and a plenary, which is at 8,050 euros. And then you have a fee per additional working group. So if you want, for example, to become a member of the finance working group, but also biodiversity credits working group, so you have this additional working group. And you also have some discounts according to the number of years you want to become a member, if it's a membership of 3 years or more, and it includes our basic working groups. Now, just a quick focus on GBS licenses that are included in the membership. So you have actually various cases. There is one first case for consultants. Well, as consultancies are selling BFAs following, they need to follow specific rules. It requires to be a B4B+ Club members, which include a license, a commercial license, and you also need to be a level 2 assessor. So we will come back on the trainings just after. And for corporate and financial institutions, it also depends actually if you are conducting a biodiversity footprinting on who is assessing and conducting the BFA. It's an internal assessor from your company, then you will need a license to access the tool. And if you want to communicate on the results, then you will need a license, but also to be a level 2 assessor and to follow training. And if the BFA is conducted by an external assessor, a consultant, then you don't need a license internally, but you still need a license just to communicate on the results. So it's a trademark license. And finally, a quick focus also on the technical supports, which you access through the B4B+ Club. So the idea that as a Global Biodiversity Score is in constant development, technical problems can occur actually. And for this, B4B+ Club members have access to technical support. So we have some regular webinars, 3 or, well, actually more 5 or 6 times a year. And you also have some individual technical support. And the idea that CDC Biodiversité will always ensure that the software will allow you to calculate impacts, and if it's not the case, then it's resolved within a week. And yeah, and for the individual technical support, you have a ticket system which allows you to ask your question. Then our team will answer it as a part of 5 hours per year of technical support for a member. So it was a very quick overview of the B4B+ Club. Do not hesitate also to have a look at our webinars if you wish to know more. And a quick question on Menti to know whether you think your company might be interested in joining the club. And if so, we will be very happy to contact you and send you all the modalities, also possibly brochures and more information on the club and on our working groups. So you can answer with the link of the Menti that was sent in the chat during the entire meeting. And as I was saying, if you want to know more on the B4B+ Club, we have some webinars that you can watch with our replay that are available on YouTube. So there is a specific webinar on the club with also some testimonies from our members. And we also held a webinar on COP15 outcomes and on trajectory reporting and biodiversity credits. And during this webinar, we also introduced into further details the biodiversity credits working group that we just launched. And now to continue with the trainings that CDC Biodiversité is proposing. So we actually are offering 4 different trainings. So we have a first one on the fundamentals of biodiversity footprint with the idea of understanding biodiversity erosion challenges and the key concepts behind biodiversity footprint assessments. And we also have a training more specifically for a financial institution, which is on biodiversity footprinting and reporting for financial institution. And the objective of this one is really to get to know the regulatory framework and related risk and tools and initiative that exist actually for the financial sector, and really get to know the ecosystem around this topic. And then we also have some trainings to actually master the GBS tool. So we have a GBS training level 1. The idea is really to get an introduction to the Global Biodiversity Score and biodiversity footprint assessment, which we started to discover today during this webinar. And there is also level 2, which has a real goal of mastering the tool and then be able to conduct biodiversity footprint assessment. So that is a level that is required for the different license that I was mentioning just before. And we have a very new training on assessor skills update with the idea of maintaining and deepening their technical skills on the GBS, as it's always evolving and with new developments. So it's also important that the assessors are kept up to date with the latest developments. So to just give you a bit more details on these various meetings, so fundamentals of biodiversity footprint, it's really aiming to understand the main stakes and key concepts around biodiversity footprinting and biodiversity. And well, it deals with the international and regulatory frameworks and biodiversity footprint's main concepts. So it's a prerequisite to access the other trainings for financial institutions, but also for level 1 and level 2 of the GBS. And well, already this training is open to anyone that wants to gain some knowledge on biodiversity footprint assessments and on this ecosystem and on this key topic. And the training is based on an online part, like a kind of autonomous part, and it's completed with a live class of 1.5 hours with a facilitator. And it also includes working on a specific case studies, and the cost is at €500 per person. And you have the next session that's also indicated on the slides. You have some sessions in September, notably. Then to give you some further details also on the 2 trainings dedicated to the Global Biodiversity Score tool. So as I was saying, these are really specific trainings to learn how to use the Global Biodiversity Score and to be able to conduct some biodiversity footprint assessment using this tool. So level 1 is composed of an entire day well, it can be both 2 half days, but the idea is to have a 7 hours meeting. And it's also required to follow the fundamentals of biodiversity footprint before. And the price is at 2,100 euros per trainee. And you have some sessions both in English and in French. Next session in English are in September, on the 5th and 6th of September. And a French session is also scheduled in November. And then for level 2, so the idea is really to master the tool and conduct biodiversity footprint assessment. And it requires to follow first the level 1 training, and it also requires to have a license for the GBS use. And this training is composed of 2 days, so it's 14 hours of training. You have, well, 8 trainees at the maximum to ensure that you are in small groups, and next sessions are just following the level 1 session. So you have English sessions in September on the between the 18th and the 21st of September, and you also have a session in French in November, and the price is of 3,500 euros per trainee. And then you have this new training on updating assessor skills. So the first session will take place on the 26th of September, and it will be really dedicated to update the knowledge of assessors, and, well, basically to allow GBS assessors to maintain and update their level of knowledge of the tool, and also of the regulatory and international framework around biodiversity footprinting, which is evolving quite quickly. So it will be 1.5 day. So it's a 3.5 hour session. It's an online class, and the price is of 500 euros per training. And finally, you also have this training on biodiversity footprint and reporting for financial institutions. So the idea is really to get familiar with biodiversity footprint framework and regulations, standardization initiatives, and so on, and also related risks and opportunities, and the tool that actually exists. And it's, well, dedicated to anyone that wants to understand the stakeholders, regulation, and this initiative specifically for financial institutions. And it's composed of 2 half days. It's an online class in English only. And next sessions will be held on October and in November. And the price is of 2,100 euros per trainee. And it also requires to follow the fundamentals of biodiversity footprint before. So kind of the same question as far as the B4B+ Club, just to get an idea whether you'd be interested in getting a training on the fundamentals, on financial institution ecosystems, or on the GBS, so level 1 and level 2. It will also help us to know whether you need to receive further information on the next dates, on the prices, and so on. We also have some documentation if you need to come back on this aspect. So do not hesitate to answer this question on the chat. And you also have a specific question for the biodiversity footprint and reporting for financial institution training more specifically. So we also know whether you are interested in the fundamentals training, or in the level 1 and level 2 trainings, or in this training for financial institution.
Thank you very much, Elisa. So now we will go to the case study part section. So we will let the question on Menti running while we present to you the case study. And now, so I will let the floor to Jacques and Kaiwei from L'Oréal. So thank you very much to them for this presentation. We will let them present to you the case study we conducted together.
Okay, so thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all the CDC Biodiversity team for letting us this opportunity to present our case study with the GBS tool, which roughly they covered the scope and input data that we use for determining our carbon carbon footprints at the corporate level, just to give you an overview of what was the scope of this study. So if you could, yes, okay, so let's move now to the objectives and of this study and the method that we use. Just for starting, so L'Oréal has a small number of commitments for biodiversity with some targets at 2030. And especially in the context of the Act for Nature, the commitment, and in the context also of our ongoing Sustainable Development Program, so named L'Oréal for the Future. And so this case study was also for us and for the CDC Biodiversity the opportunity to test finally a calculated static climate change impact based on dynamic ones, and also to have this possibility to translate a certain number of our commitment for biodiversity into quantified targets with the GBS tool, and thus suggest some trajectories for reducing our impact to meet our targets. So very interesting case study for us. And this case study finally constitutes one of the first POC of the applicability of the GBS tool for determination of biodiversity impact trajectories. So to try to achieve our commitments at the corporate level. So let's move to the next slide, please, Rachel. So what was the scope of our study finally? So this study covered direct and upstream activities of L'Oréal. So for the scope 1, all our sites, so plants, offices, distribution centers, and for upstream scope 3, so what is related to ingredient and packaging production, so for cosmetic products, transport from suppliers to plants, so energy and refrigerant gas consumption, especially for our subcontracted sites. So, but in that case, for this site, so water consumption and land use was excluded because we didn't have access to this data. And so, very important point, the fact that maybe the downstream scope 3 was not included in our study. So, all impact related to the product use, the cosmetic product used by our consumers, and so the fate of waste regarding packaging and ingredients contained in our formula, especially for the potential impact in the aquatic compartments. And so this study was related to the year of, for the input data 2019, with also some data coming from the year before, so 2018. Let's move to the next slide, please, Rachel. So in terms of input data used for making this assessment, if we start with the terrestrial biodiversity assessment, so to cover the different pressures under the scope of this study, we use for scope 1, so land occupation related to our different sites, so distribution centers, administrative sites, urban sites, plants, and so on, and the greenhouse gas emissions for also our sites. And for the upstream part, so scope of the scope 3, so all data related to the land occupation, especially for the production of our packaging materials and the feedstocks used to produce our cosmetic ingredients were included in the scope for the different type of pressure that we try to calculate for the scope 3. And if we move to the next slide, please. So for the freshwater biodiversity part, so for covering these different pressure also under the scope, so we used for the scope 1 water consumption of our sites and all data related to the land occupation of our different sites as well. And for upstream scope 3, so we use specifically so water consumption data and other data related to the yes, I would say production of our packaging materials, and all data also related to the production of feedstocks, plant feedstocks for generating our cosmetic ingredient used in our formula. And so that was, yes, roughly the scope of the data. We have on time to go into detail. So I propose to move to the next slide, maybe, Rachel. And so for land conversion between 2018 and 2019, so as we have only data related to 2018, so we use also natural average land conversion rates for determination of data for the next year. And so for the static climate change determination, so we applied a method recommended by CDC Biodiversité, so consisting of very simply try to multiply finally the climate change dynamics of the year of reference 2019 by 60, just to cover all the historic of emission of greenhouse gas by our company before this reference year. And this, yes, equation changed a bit for the recent study, because I think that according to work done by CDC Biodiversité, they refined this data, and it's now currently 50 just to estimate the climate change static. Let's move. Yes, and so as mentioned before, it was one goal was also to try to translate finally our quantified targets in terms of biodiversity using the GBS tools. A certain number of targets we published at L'Oréal, especially within the framework of our yes, Sustainable Development Program, L'Oréal for the Future. And the first one was the Action 1. So by 2030, 100% of the bio-based ingredients for formula and packaging material will be traceable and will come from sustainable sources. So translated for generous GBS application to a dynamic impact from crops commodity null at 2030. So another translation was for the Action 3. So by 2030, 100% of our industrial sites and all our operated buildings will have a positive impact on biodiversity compared to the reference year, so 2019. So translated in the dynamic impacts, so calculated by GBS of each site of scope 1 being negative or null in 2030. And so last try, I would say, for Action 5 to limit our impact on natural habitat, we are committed at L'Oréal to keep the all flats by 2030, the total land occupancy vital to the sourcing of our ingredients compared to the 2019, which is a very important part of our, I would say, biodiversity footprint at L'Oréal currently. And so this Commonwealth was translated in a static terrestrial land use impact in 2030 being the same as the one in 2019. So very ambitious objective, I would say, but let's move now to the next part with the presentation by Kaiwei of the results of some takeaway message before keeping maybe some question if you have time.
Thank you, Jacques. So here we dive right into the results of the trajectory that we drew up together with CDC Biodiversité. So what we can see on the graph here, maybe just to explain a little bit how the graph is constructed. So in light green, we see basically the results of the reference year, so 2019, which is divided into 3 major pillars. So we have the climate change representing for 34% of the global biodiversity footprint, with some of the indicators from the pollution on the terrestrial biodiversity, so the N, F, and E representing around 15% of the global impact. And then finally, the land use static impact, so we also call the spatial pressures, representing around 51% of the global impact. So based on this reference year, so in orange, you see the dynamic impact representing around plus 0.8% each year. So for around a 10-year period, so each year we will have this 0.8% that is added to our reference year results, which in 2030 we will arrive at a 108% of the terrestrial static impact, meaning that overall in 10-year period, we will basically, if we stay in a business as usual scenario, we will increase our biodiversity impact on the terrestrial biome by 8%. So what Jacques just presented, the translation of different actions into the quantifiable targets for action 1, 3, and 5, roughly translates into around 2.6, 2.7% of decrease over the 10-year period, leading us to 106% of the global biodiversity footprint, compared to the 100% that we see at the beginning of this trajectory. So this is a very first estimation of what the applicability of the method. There might be some overlaps also of different actions because they're all very interlinked. So action 5 might have also some benefits that is already counted in action 3, for example, in this blocks. However, this also means it might seem that we still have an increase on the biodiversity footprint, even with the action 1, 3, and 5. But we have to keep in mind that these are some actions that are very centered around the land use. So we do have also a lot of the engagement and commitments around the pollution, around the climate change that are not necessarily represented here. So hopefully a further study would also help us refine this data to show that we would have a positive impact on biodiversity with all the actions that we have in our Sustainable Development Program. So this is some of the first results on the terrestrial compartments. And if we go to the next slide, as we have the habit also to report separately, that's the terrestrial compartment and aquatic compartment. So similarly, you guys can see in light green the reference year results in 2019 with a 0.2% of increase, mostly due to the dynamic impact in a business as usual scenario. And then the action 1 and 3 roughly translates into a 0.2% of decrease over a 10-year period, leading us to around 1.6% of increase in the aquatic static impact after reduction in 2030. So this is basically the how the trajectory can look when we try to quantify different targets and actions into this roadmap of reduction. If we go to the next slide, some of the key messages that we can spot from this case study is that terrestrial and aquatic static impacts are driven mostly by spatial pressures, as we mentioned before, land use mostly, to cite an example, and also hydrological disturbances due to the direct water use respectively. And also we do have a strong impact contribution from the land climate change, especially in the terrestrial dynamic impact compartment. And the majority of L'Oréal's impact within the selected scopes are upstream scope 3, which is already expected as well, compared to our current understanding of our biodiversity impact, as well as all that's on our carbon footprint, for example. And to go back to also the objectives of the case study, which is certainly to test the climate change static impact methodology, and also to see the applicability of the GBS tool on the quantification of the beneficial effects on biodiversity through different actions in our program. We do see that those targets are achieved here, and there's definitely potential to explore this tool further to do a more extensive study. And if we go further, we do spot some limits also of this current case study. First of all, in terms of scope, the downstream scope 3, as mentioned by Jacques, is not evaluated here, which still constitutes a very important part of our eco-design strategy, for example, when it comes to product use phase, and also the end of life of our products, whether it's packaging or the formula. Some of the transport and processing of our raw materials is also not evaluated here to have really, let's say, do a first and foremost a focus just on the commodity parts. The granularity on the data on the agricultural practices are pretty limited. So when it comes to some specific agricultural practices, we've implemented in the upstream supply chain, we are unable to see, let's say, the benefits or the specificities on the first results. And of course, the study was done on the GBS tool version 1.2.1, which is currently known to have an overestimation of the impact on hydrological disturbances, which is probably also one of the reasons why it came out as one of the more contributive parts in the aquatic compartment. And of course, we're also limited by the data availability at the time. So world average impact factors are applied whenever regionalization is not possible. Again, hydrological disturbances here were limited because of the data collection didn't extend to some of the sites. So averages are, and let's say the same quantities are applied for some of the sites, and also the temporality of the study, again, is based on the data recovered from 2018 and 19. So there has also been some improvements in terms of the traceability and the data quality since then. So we're hopeful that this can be seen also in future studies.
Thank you so much, Jacques and Kaiwei, for this presentation. So I hope it was interesting for the participants. So we are running a bit late, so sorry we won't have time to take additional questions. We answered to the majority of them into the chat, but just a few words, ending words. So you will find in the slides, so we will send you the slide a few days after the webinar. You will have the link to all our current publications. And we will also send you the replay of the webinar will be also available. So do not hesitate to share with your colleagues or people you know that were interested in the webinar. So thank you very much for your attention, and I thank also the whole team today for this presentation, and for sure Jacques and Jacques and Kaiwei, sorry, for the case study. And you will have the emails available to contact us if you need. Thank you very much and have a nice day.